Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behavior nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behavior geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behavior nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. You'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behavior geeks. But we will start today's episode where I am really excited to bring back to the Animal Training Academy podcast show the excellent Terrie Hayward. Terrie first joined us in March last year for episode 141. So I highly encourage everyone to head back and check out that episode as well, if you haven't already listened. Terrie Hayward has a master's in education and is a faculty member of the Karen Pryor Academy, a KPA Certified Training Partner, and a certified professional dog trainer through the Council of Professional Dog Trainers. Additionally, she's also certified in Canine Separation Anxiety. She is a CSAT and is a certified dog behavior consultant with the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants, the IAABC. She is a member of the Pet Professional Guild and has written articles on training for Barks Magazine, Pet Business, and Grooming Business magazine, and is the author of 3 books: A Deaf Dog Joins the Family, co-author, Grooming Without Stress, Safer, Quicker, Happier, and Your 10 Minutes a Day Dog. Terrie works with families and their animal companions, presents workshops, travels, and consults, focusing on positive reinforcement interactions and modifying behavior through applications in behavior analysis. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome back to the show today, Terrie Hayward, who is patiently waiting by. Terrie, thank you so much for taking the time to come and hang out with us again at Animal Training Academy.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm happy to have the chance to talk with you today.
And you're recording from your makeshift dwelling while you wait for your concrete bunker to be finalized on the hillside of the beautiful, because you keep sharing these amazing images on social media, British Virgin Islands.
Yeah, it's fun. I like to remind myself
it's fun, you process. Say with a big sigh.
I was saying, we were talking to the head honcho today, and we're like, the finish is in sight, right? It will be nice to be reunited with all of our things that are in boxes and have been for a year. So we'll be like, wow, I didn't know I had kitchen towels with the dog face on them, or, that kind of thing. I have no recollection what's in most of these boxes. So it's going to be exciting times coming up soon.
But the view from your house is just, you can see the curvature of your island and the beach below and an expanse of ocean. It looks like something from a holiday brochure.
Yeah, we lived here. This is our 3rd time. So third time's a charm is the plan. And yes, looking for a zen, relaxing spot. And, someday always looking for pet sitters. So, get in touch.
I'll send Anna Bartosik, our happiness engineer, your way. That's what she does. She travels the world pet sitting. So
there you go.
Her ears are probably perking up right now as she's listening to this. Hey, Terrie, you recently reached out to me as excitingly, you've published your online course offering about working with deaf dogs. And consequently, I'm excited to be able to share this with the ATA audience as I'm sure it's relevant for listeners who might care for a deaf animal themselves, or many others who have come across clients with deaf animals. And I'm sure interesting for those who might not have worked with a deaf animal to hear about the nuances of adding that variable to your training. From my understanding, a significant antecedent for you and the creation of this course was your own experience obtaining, caring for, and training your deaf dog, Blanca. And so I'd love to hear about Blanca's story, if that's okay.
So some folks that were in rescue had reached out to me. They had a dog that had just had puppies, and they were looking for a foster family for her. Then they'd actually found one with a friend of mine, and then she reached out because Blanca was very mouthy and jumpy. And she said, could you give me a hand with this dog and her 11 puppies? And so initially we didn't realize she was deaf. I had shown up with my treat pouch full of hot dogs and my handy clicker. And of course she was responding to my body language and my, again, pouch of yummy goodies. But then she was, quote, not a very good mom. That was not me saying that. That was the person fostering her, because she was ignoring, quote, all of the puppy's cries. And my friend would show up to the crate where she would be sleeping with the puppies, and she wouldn't awaken until she was right there. So slowly we figured out that she was deaf. And then she said, once the puppies were all adopted, could you maybe foster her? And so I was fostering her while she went through heartworm treatment. And my husband had started to say, hey, how is this foster dog, situation, looking for a home for this dog thing going? And I was like, yeah, well, she's deaf and it's just a lot of things to work on with her. And I would love to see her like adopted by like a trainer, a positive reinforcement trainer. And he was like, okay, I can read the writing on the wall there. I get what you're saying. So that's how Blanca ended up in our home. And yeah.
and so how old was she at this stage, do you think?
She was only about one and a half, somewhere in that range. She was quite young. But she ended up changing sort of the trajectory of focus for me, because then once I realized she was deaf, I hadn't really paid attention to a deaf dog or the obviously possibility that dogs could be deaf previous to that. And then I started Googling and learning more, and I was looking for resources and just for curiosity's sake. And I didn't find a lot out there, which was what led me to write the book, A Deaf Dog Joins a Family. And that's several years ago now. And so just as I went on, and I have a Facebook group, Deaf Dogs Behavior and Training, and there's just a lot of people in there. And I often present on working with deaf dogs, which really is just non-auditory communication. And even if we work with hearing animals, we often use visual cues. It's a good way to expand your repertoire and, think about other ways to communicate for anyone working with animals. And so, I felt like we should take it to the next step, and hence was where the idea for a course sprung from, which really just covers everything from deafness to positive reinforcement training to sort of A to B. And I tried to focus on basics, but also behaviors that came up as common questions with people needing assistance, but just much better communication and ways that we could integrate a deaf dog into the family and have everybody be comfortable and happy and good communicators together.
So with deafness, with Blanca, do you know why she's deaf?
Yeah, she was born deaf. So there's congenital deafness and acquired deafness. And until my dog George passed away, we actually had two deaf dogs. George was deaf because he was about 17, and he over time became deaf. But a lot of times dogs who are white are deaf, not always. Not all white dogs are deaf, and not all deaf dogs are white, but frequently dogs who are deaf will have lack of pigmentation in their head area, because it's the lack of pigmentation on the inner ear hairs. It's like a tongue twister that causes the nerve endings to not develop or to die, and then we don't have hearing. But yeah, so a a lot of times too, when people see her and they're just watching us communicate, kind of oftentimes will cock their head and be like, are you, talking to that dog, but you're not speaking? And I'll say, oh yeah, she's deaf. And many times others haven't heard of a deaf dog before too. So they're kind of interested in how that works and how we communicate.
So is the lack of pigmentation, is that analogous to, or is it some form of, the word's slipping my mind now, albinism? Would that be the correct way of saying it? Albino? I
don't believe it's the same thing, but also, for example, dogs who have a Merle gene, Merle breeding or piebald gene, there are certain genetic, what's the word I'm looking for? Propensities towards deafness, where you should avoid things like inappropriate breeding that may lead to a dog being blind or deaf, or blind and deaf. So also, if dogs are deaf, genetic testing would be appropriate, and probably not the best idea to breed, because they may pass on that genetic trait of deafness.
And so now I'm curious about her puppies. What was the hearing ability of her puppies?
They could all hear. Yeah, they were all hearing puppies. Yeah, we suspect we know who the dad was, because it was also rescued by the same group, and he was hearing dog. But yeah, all of her puppies were able to hear. Although one of her puppies looked a lot like her and was adopted in the States by a man who drove a truck like a big 18-wheeler truck, long distance trucker. And he apparently had bought a copy of my book, and he would tell people, this is my dog's mom, because she would ride in the cab with him all the time, which I thought was a funny story.
And when you started to realize that Blanca was deaf, can you do any kinds of tests to test that out? Or can someone listening to this podcast do a test, or do you just kind of look at the obvious?
Well, the obvious and DIY, do-it-yourself at-home kind of testing is dogs who are deaf frequently appear to sleep very soundly. And again, the obvious is that they may not respond to noises like the vacuum cleaner or fireworks or thunder or doorbells, which can be positive in many instances. There is an official test done by a veterinarian called a BEAR test, which stands for Brainstem Evoked, BAER, Brainstem Auditory Evoked Response. Sorry about that. Having said that, it only can test whether the ear is hearing or not. It doesn't give you the level of hearing. And so many times, just testing at home is sufficient. They do have to attach some electrodes, and it's not an uncomfortable per se procedure, but it could be an annoyance to the dog, and having to go into the veterinarian, et cetera, et cetera. So whilst we never would want to startle the dog, once we kind of made sure that approaching and unawares and the dog was not responding, and then we'd want to make sure that there was not vibration on the floor that would cue the dog into you coming up near them, behind them, etc. You could try, and I show in my course that you can try with something more innocuous like a snap, and then move maybe to clapping, and then move up to something louder, again, to avoid the potential of startling the animal.
And did you do that with Blanca?
Well, because she had the
vet test, I mean.
We didn't do a BEAR test. In fact, we were living in Puerto Rico at the time, and I'm not positive that the option exists on the island. I didn't look into it further. For our case, we didn't have any particular reason to further test. We knew that we lived through a hurricane with her, and she slept through the whole thing. She was the only one of us that slept really well with all of that noise going on. But just in general, we lived in a concrete house, so she couldn't feel vibrations when you were approaching, and she would sleep again when you're coming up near her. And once more, not all kinds of sounds would happen. A lot of times when I would take her, for example, to the farmer's market, there would be sort of this bench full of older gentlemen, because the farmer's market was in the town square, sort of by the church. And they would see, she had a patch at the time that said deaf dog, and I'd hear them talking, like, a dog deaf. And then they'd all be trying to clap behind her to test it on their own. And then they'd be like, wow, she didn't respond to that. Huh, that's interesting. So that's apparently quite a common thing, is that you say the dog's deaf and people are like, but is the dog really deaf though? And they want to kind of test it for themselves. So
it's like a wet paint sign. It's like, is it really wet paint?
Let me just touch it and see. Yeah.
So you're living in a concrete house with the hurricane. I'm assuming there would be some kind of vibrations in the house with that intensity of weather?
I wondered if the change in barometric pressure would affect her and that she would note that, but nope, the cats were not pleased. Our other dog was not happy. We weren't thrilled, but she was snoozing. She thought it was grand. We were all in the same room together for like 24 hours straight, all cuddled up. She was not affected by the hurricane at all. So.
Well, I was going to ask, do you sense that her other senses are heightened in regards to other dogs you've worked with? Do you see her react differently to vibrations or movement?
Not a lot to vibration. The house that we're temporarily in is wooden, so it does have vibrations. And we do note, she might be sleeping on the couch, for example, and someone will come down the stairs and she perks up, or the porch is wooden outside. And when we come home, she generally is looking out the door from the couch, probably having felt the vibration. Having said that, our house, like I said previously, was concrete, and she would often be upstairs in the back where the bedroom was with the door closed. And my husband would say, she knew you were home, and there was no way she could have heard or felt any vibration. So I wonder if olfactory, that'd be pretty strong, but that's the only option that we could come up with. And she does have a good sense of smell. So possibly it's anecdotal information, but possibly her sense of smell is compensating and stronger because of the lack of hearing. Again, not confirmed, and only our story. So
how did you, when you realized she was deaf, and you mentioned that you hadn't worked with a deaf dog, like what was your process to explore that? What is your creative process to, well, let me backtrack a little bit. You said you jumped on Google and you had a little bit of a look around. I'm assuming you didn't find much. Is that what you said? Like, how did you then approach it? How does Terrie Hayward approach a situation like that?
Well, there was information, but again, as a professional trainer, there wasn't information that I could really get behind. Some stuff was okay, and some stuff was not okay. So I thought, well, the first thing we need to do is be able to communicate with each other. So instead of having an auditory marker, we need some other form of way for me to say, yes, that's what earned you access to something you find reinforcing. So instead of a clicker that makes a sound, we use a visual clicker. You could certainly use a tactile marker as well. And we do have some tactile cues. For example, my name recall, if you will, for her is a double tap, which means orient to me, please. And then I mark and reinforce that behavior. So once we had the marker and reinforcer on board, then it was next just thinking about what kinds of cues would be best to go ahead and get on board next. And again, the orient to me was one that was important. Then I started to think about, wow, what if I based cues in ASL, for example, but I recommend perhaps modifying to things that you can do with one hand. So you have your other hand free for the leash or for treats. One time I do one of the first cues, which I wouldn't teach now, but then I did, was sit. Again, sit is not a first cue that I would teach at this point in my life, my career. But I had taken her to a doggy sort of, it was like a wellness day where people had booths and, they could buy all kinds of products. And I asked her to sit, and then she sat and I marked and reinforced. And a gentleman and his wife came over to me and he said, were you just signing to the dog? Did you ask her to sit? That's what we thought we saw. And I said, yeah, she's deaf. And he said, oh, my wife's deaf. And she saw that. And she was so excited. And so I said, well, you can ask her to sit if you want. And so she asked her to sit and she sat. And the wife actually started crying because she said, we have a dog and I could never communicate with my dog. And I said, well, sure you can. You can teach your dog, who was a hearing dog, visual cues, that's no problem at all. In fact, one of the things often that I'll talk about is the advantage of teaching visual or tactile cues to animals, because like we said in the beginning, you may not have a congenitally deaf dog, but your dog, like my other dog, George, could have acquired deafness through any number of issues, but not including old age. So having those on board can help it not to be such a scary transition if your dog does lose hearing later in life or at some other point. Plus, you can be sort of, it's not really, but sneaky. You know, people think it's so cool that you've done something and your dog does some kind of response without speaking to them.
That sounds like a moving experience with that lady. I imagine she navigates through life with a sense of frustration at times at not being able to communicate. So that's amazing. I'd be curious to know if she went home and explored that more with her dog. You talked about visual markers and tactile markers and cues as well. Do you have a marker you can use if Blanca's not close to you and isn't looking directly at you?
Mm-hmm. So one of the other first things was to foster a frequent check-in behavior. So anytime she voluntarily decided to look back in my direction, I would mark and reinforce that behavior. And as we know, behaviors that are reinforced are repeated. So I wanted that to be a behavior that she would offer frequently so that then I could provide additional direction. In addition, if she is on her leash, I will do a double tug, which is not pulling her leash, but I do tug, which equates just like the double tap for orient to me in the same way that I would like her to turn back, at which point I mark and reinforce that behavior. And I thought to do 2 taps or 2 tugs just to differentiate between any accidental bumping into her or going by her, so that she would recognize that this was an intentional interaction.
And I'm assuming that some of the advice you saw that you didn't like had to do with electric collars?
Yes, there's a lot of that. And, general punitive information, teaching no, be the alpha, that kind of stuff. So I wanted to make sure that we had, basically working with a deaf dog or blind dog or deaf and blind dog is just the same type of good, positive reinforcement communication that we want for any animal. But just like we have like special breed specific groups, there are certainly niche areas where people, I think, with a deaf dog go to find other people that share that experience and look for information there. And so I wanted to provide resources that could be trusted resources, that could be valid resources for that community of people who would be seeking that type of information.
And do people use those collars in the positive reinforcement contingencies to communicate like on a vibration setting? I mean, because I imagine that even for some people using that tool just has aversive emotions follow the use of that in their contingencies.
Yeah.
But I see that it might have value.
Yeah.
The vibrating setting.
Right. There are, and I wrote a whole blog post on this, which if you'd like, I can send you the link for that too. Make myself a little note. So vibration collars is a question that comes up frequently, hence my blog post on it. I'm not against vibration collars. I certainly am against shock collars. And I recommend that if people are going to use a vibration collar, that first they read my blog post, but I'll kind of summarize for you, and they not use a shock collar because the accidents happen. And it also can be a slippery slope if you're using a collar and then you're frustrated. And then next thing you do, you've slid over into the shock instead of the vibration, which we never ever want to happen. So with regard to vibration collars, we can certainly counter condition and desensitize this to be a tool that is comfortable. However, the reason I recommend that we not jump straight to a vibration collar is that I feel like it's a more advanced tool. One, because you need to know what desensitization and counter conditioning mean and how to do it properly so that you aren't using flooding instead. And also, I would like to see on the human side, again, some skills in place, like understanding positive reinforcement, like mechanics and timing that are good, like, again, understanding and proper use of desensitization and counter conditioning. And then on the animal side, I'd like to see, again, that check-in behavior as a fluent behavior. And I'd like to see the communication between marking and reinforcing, human and animal there, and some basic cues like a place cue, like a hand target or another type of targeting behavior, like a recall. And I feel like once you already have those in place, then you might choose to use a vibration collar, but at that point, you might not even need it. However, if you did choose to use a vibration collar at that point, again, it would be once you have this foundation of information on the side of the caregiver or trainer and the animal so that you could be successful.
So you say it's a more advanced tool, and it seems I'm taking away from your stories that Blanca attracts a lot of attention when you're out and about, and the uniqueness of, for a lot of people, coming across a deaf dog. And then you're saying that it's the basics of positive reinforcement and timing, and it all just applying it to this context and changing it from auditory cues and markers. So what problems do people come to you with then? Is it the same problems that people without deaf dogs come to you with, or are there a unique bag of problems that people are coming to you with?
Yep. I think that they're probably the same kinds of things. You know, we have jumping, we have mouthing, we have barking, we have, and sometimes, just as an aside with barking, we'll see people attribute that additional barking as a deaf dog kind of I'll say attribute, which it's not to my knowledge. So I always want to make sure that if we're saying something, that it's rooted in data. To my knowledge, deaf dogs don't bark any more or less. You know, this is study of one individual dog kind of stuff. And also, again, recall is a question that a lot of people have, because they normally would say to their dog, come, or some other verbal cue that would get the dog to return to them. And they wonder how they can do that with a deaf dog. And then everything from teaching incompatible behaviors, like I mentioned, like a stationing behavior as opposed to begging at the table. And people often want to know how to stop behavior, which of course, instead of stopping and decreasing, we want to teach something that you can reinforce instead. So I also wrote a blog post on and did a YouTube video of why I don't teach no. I don't teach no with deaf dogs. I don't teach it with hearing dogs either, because I'd rather teach what to do and build a long and strong reinforcement history for those behaviors instead. But I think that where the default is just to say no, if in the moment a dog is doing something that the people don't want the dog to be doing, that they're just kind of they take a pause and are wondering, okay, well, I have a deaf dog, so how do I communicate that? So I view it as an opportunity to say, right, well, instead, we don't even need to teach no. Take it off the table. We can do better. So we can instead mark and reinforce stuff that we want to see more of. So,
and I was going to ask, do you find deaf dogs bark any differently? So you answered that. Thank you. With Blanca, do you always have her on a lead, or can you take her off lead in a safe place, and she checks in with you enough that you feel comfortable? How do you manage that?
I'm a safety girl. So where we used to live in Puerto Rico, we used to have some tennis courts where I would take her to practice long distance recalls. I do have a couple of really long lines for her that I use at the beach. But sometimes there are off-leash dogs, or who knows. So our house will have a fenced yard. So even though I wouldn't leave her outside on her own, she will be able to move around without being on her leash, which is really exciting, because since we've moved, there hasn't been a spot that here we've been able to have her off leash. Again, she's got a long lead, so I don't feel like she's necessarily suffering in any way. And she has some with her age now, she has some issues with her hips, et cetera. So she's all right not to be running and frolicking like a little puppy, but I think it'll be exciting to have her have space where she can be off leash. There are people that do have deaf dogs that have them off leash. And certainly, like with a hearing dog, you could foster a really great recall. The issue for me is I think a lot of times I find that the recall is not proofed to that level, even with hearing animals. So again, I always advocate for safety first.
And do you feel that working with Blanca and other deaf animals now that you've become, that's helped push your training forward in ways that potentially you wouldn't have been pushed forward without that experience?
I do, yes, because again, I think you sort of rely on your verbal cues. And when you all of a sudden have to think about other options, other ways to communicate, it just sort of opens up, your sphere of what's possible. What I find with people who newly adopt a deaf dog are these sort of two first emotions, either anxiety because they're not sure how they're going to be able to communicate with their dog who doesn't hear, and fear that their dog won't be able to live a nice, fulfilling, quote, normal life, which of course deaf dogs can. And so I think sort of recognizing, as I mentioned earlier, that opportunity to sometimes have like a clean slate. People adopt a dog or have a dog join their family that is hearing, they can sort of fall back by and large on auditory cues. And when all of a sudden that go-to option is no longer available to you, people feel a little bit at unease. So just getting folks to, think outside of that wheelhouse and learn new ways to communicate that at first might be a little bit uncomfortable, but really are not hard at all, just sort of stretches all of us. So in a good way.
Awesome. And you mentioned a couple of blog posts. So where can people go to find these and find the course, and how does it all work?
Yep. Positive Animal Wellness is my website.com. And under courses is where the new course is located. And there's a special discount code for your ATA folks, which the code is ATA. It'll give you 10% off, and that is currently through March of 2022. And under blog on that same website is where people can find the posts I've mentioned.
Well, thank you very much for the special code. And you said that goes until the end of March 2022.
Correct. Yes.
Awesome. And we'll link to all of that in the show notes as well. Hey, I'm looking forward to building on everything we've already talked about and moving into this next part. I'm excited to be able to draw from your experience even more, Terrie, as you have put together a list for us of your top 5 must-know essential considerations for when working with deaf dogs and or other animals, because I know you don't only work with deaf dogs. So can you please get us started with your number 1?
I will. And we have kind of touched upon these a little bit. The fact that those 2 common emotions come up, but that they don't need to be limiting in any way. It's always surprising to me and of course others, I think, that even today, many times if someone was to find out a dog is deaf, that the response is that they should be put to sleep. Because again, the implication there is that they couldn't live a fulfilling life and that people couldn't effectively communicate with them and vice versa. So recognizing that those common emotions of anxiety and fear are certainly valid, but not necessarily, well, not at all, something that should preclude someone from welcoming a deaf dog to share their lives with them.
Those 2 emotions being fear and anxiety from the individuals, not fear and anxiety that their life's going to be impacted, but fear and anxiety that they're not going to be able to provide the dog with a fulfilling life.
I think also, yes, that their life will be impacted because they maybe had all these dreams and goals of things that they were going to do with their dog, like they were going to do sports or they were going to do, and all of a sudden they feel like, wow, maybe that's not a possibility when it certainly is in most cases. So, they just sort of had this idea of what their life with this new dog was going to look like. And all of a sudden they were sort of thrown for a side there where they all of a sudden realized they wouldn't be able to communicate as they'd planned, which was just by giving verbal cues, and that they now would have to adapt in some way, which again isn't a difficult way. It's just starting to think about things a little bit outside of the box. So, yeah.
It sounds like many clients who come to us who
It sure does.
are experiencing grief for the dog that they wish they had or that they envisioned they were going to have.
I said to someone just recently, it was a different context, but I said, I think sometimes, the dog is sent to you for a reason, and you grow and learn because of the dog in front of you, most definitely. And so, like I had said, my training career kind of took a little bit of a different direction when we adopted Blanca. So a positive one for sure. So we have to look at situations that, again, may put us outside of our comfort zone a little bit, like opportunities, the opportunities that they are.
How old is Blanca now?
Well, she's been 9 for a couple of years now. So 9-ish, maybe 10. I'm not positive. We don't know exactly how old she was when we first adopted her. We think about 1.5 years, between 1 and 2 years. So, and just like the rest of us through COVID times, we just sort of had a couple of years that became a blur there. So,
and how often are people getting in contact with you specifically for help with deaf animals? Daily?
Yeah.
And I say deaf animals. So you told me you're working with a cat recently. What other species?
Yeah, I have only worked with deaf dogs. The cat that I was working with is hearing, although I did hear about somebody who had a deaf dog and they also had a deaf cat. So I feel like probably just the way I was oblivious to the community of folks who had shared their homes with deaf dogs, that there are probably all kinds of animals that are deaf that we're just not hearing about because we're not in those circles at this time.
Do you think there's animals living with people? I'm sure there is, but do you think that people don't realize their animals are deaf sometimes? Have you ever come across that?
It comes on pretty quickly that you catch on. Yep. Because again, the dog doesn't respond. Although sometimes animals end up in shelters because they're not able to learn cues when it's just that people haven't recognized that they're not responding to the verbal cues. But yeah, it's again, the sleeping really deeply, the not waking up when you approach, the not responding to noises in the house. So people start to question that pretty quickly. And oftentimes folks that come into the Facebook group that I've got will say, that they adopted the dog and they didn't know the dog was deaf. And then once they start doing a little research and they realize, oh, my dog's all white, again, doesn't have to correlate, but and yes, my dog sleeps really intently too. And wow, my son dropped, a plate on the floor and there was no reaction. And so, yeah, it doesn't take long to kind of figure it out.
And do you think when in the future you see more deaf dogs in your life? Is that something you would like to somehow embrace, or
in my family? Or
yeah, in your family?
Yes. Well, if it was up to me, positively, absolutely. I would always like to adopt a deaf dog. So yeah, we'll see.
Number one is fear and anxiety is common, but there is a process for those working with clients with deaf dogs to help and guide their understanding to how those animals and their clients can have fulfilling lives, and those who are caring for a deaf dog to help them understand that as well. Have I answered number one correctly?
Yes. So absolutely. Yeah. There's always a way forward. And as soon as you recognize that it doesn't have to be scary or impossible at all. And again, my Facebook community is one resource for people who are feeling like, I don't know anybody like me who has a deaf dog. And then all of a sudden they realize, wow, there are a lot of people out there. And, the internet allows us to connect that way. And again, feel that sense of community, which I think can be very comforting to people too.
Yeah, absolutely. What's number two?
Well, it's pretty basic, but training equals education, communication. And I say that because sometimes it feels like it's out of people's wheelhouse to learn new fluent communication skills, because all of a sudden they're needing to communicate instead of with their mouth and speaking or making sounds, with hand gestures or with touch. And many times people are not used to that. So just remembering that that training is happening all the time with every interaction, that we just want to make it very purposeful, and that just like with animals who are hearing, we want to think about a cue that is easy for everybody who's going to be using it, and that it's consistent, and which I'm already spilling over into number 3, but just that practice and getting more comfortable with communicating with an animal without speaking. I don't discourage speaking to a deaf dog on that note either, because I think, well, unless we're wearing a mask, which many places still do, but that they certainly can read the emotion that's going on in your face. So I think that's an important component as well. And also, if you're talking to the dog and you're saying, "Oh, what a good puppy," you're conveying versus good puppy without any kind of emotion. So I think it helps to convey the message as well.
So training and communication is happening all of the time, and for those working with clients or working with deaf dogs themselves, just be cognizant of what you're doing and how that's how your dog is interacting with what you're doing, and what you're doing is interacting with your dog.
Yeah, and just thinking about the fact that you're just using a different mode of communication. So instead of speaking, you're using visual cues or tactile cues, and that just takes a little bit of practice, just like anytime we're starting something new, that it just needs a little bit of, again, for lack of a better word, practice to gain some fluency. And then it doesn't become odd or uncomfortable. So, yeah.
You said that was spilling over into number 3.
Yeah. Which I think the keys are to foster those check-ins, which I mentioned at the beginning, and have consistent cues, just like with hearing animals. If your deaf dog is not used to looking your way, then it will be harder to be able to provide information, especially if they are out of your physical touch range, meaning because you couldn't give them a tactile cue. So, and in terms of the cues, like I was saying, just like with hearing animals, if they're confusing or people may not realize they're confusing, if one person is doing, this for down and somebody else is doing this for down and somebody else is doing this, they might think that they're the same, but to the animal that could look completely different. So being very specific with your visual cues, I think can, just like with your verbal cues, can be very helpful in communicating more effectively and efficiently. And again, especially at the beginning, just every time that animal looks to you, marking and reinforcing. I don't do a lot of the look at me cue because, again, I want it to be a voluntary behavior that the dog decides to look, and then we build a long, strong reinforcement history for the behavior, and thus they want to do it more. So you said at the beginning, marking and reinforcing it heavily. Over time, you just turn that into a different schedule of reinforcement where they get reinforced occasionally for checking in. How does that work now on your walks with Blanca? So just like any behavior, like you said, the schedule of reinforcement can change to being varied so that you produce persistence in the behavior you're looking for, which in this case is checking in. So at the beginning, we're marking and reinforcing with great frequency. And then over time, we start to vary it. I still do on occasion because, again, I want to keep that behavior persistently present. And of course, if we're in a more difficult scenario, like a new place or with some more exciting things going on, if she was to orient to me and check in, I would choose to mark and reinforce that as well.
Number 4.
Yep. So marking and reinforcing, this is a tip. Oftentimes this can really help with mechanics. So if at the beginning we're trying to teach, for example, clients that we want you to mark and then reinforce so that it's not simultaneous, but sequential. So mark first and then reinforce so that the animal is not paying attention to just the food or your treat pouch. Oftentimes with deaf animals, what I'll suggest to clients is that they use the same hand. So then they're marking and then reaching into their treat pouch. And just by nature of the fact that you're using that same hand, you're not marking with one, reaching at the same time with the other. So we get those nice clean mechanics without even much thought to the process because they're just using the hand for both marking and reinforcing.
I'm curious to hear what number 5 is. Thus far, I'm wondering if I just said to you, can you tell us 5 things about training any dog that we could have potentially come up with a very similar list?
Absolutely.
I think the chickens is quite specific to, and the reasoning around that anyway. So what's number 5? I'm dying to know.
And we touched on this too, that there are so many advantages to sharing your home with a deaf dog. Like I said, the vacuum, the thunder, hurricane, fireworks, people often have dogs who have sound sensitivities. Doesn't apply if you have a deaf dog. So I really think that that's such a nice consideration, so if people are thinking about or considering adopting a deaf dog, again, I say 100% go for it. And it might not be something that someone has considered. Also, again, the fact that, if you're in a place and you don't have to speak to communicate. That certainly goes, like you said, true for dogs who are hearing too. And it's nice, again, to incorporate those visual or tactile cues. But having a deaf dog and having the opportunity, again, to learn to communicate in a slightly different way. I think, again, that stretching of your own comfort zone and abilities is a plus for sure. So I would, as you alluded to earlier, definitely adopt a deaf dog into my home again, given the opportunity.
Number 1, recognizing fear and anxiety is common amongst owners and ancestral clients, but they can obviously live a fulfilling life, and can their dog, regardless of being deaf or a hearing dog. Number 2, training and communication is happening all of the time. Just be cognizant of that. Number 3, chickens and consistent cues are very important. Number 4, marking and reinforcing. And that idea of doing the visual marker, it sounds like a great idea for training anyone to start to think about and practice timing when beginning to learn markers for the first time. I'll take that away today. That was cool. Number 5, sound sensitivities are not something you have to be dealing with deaf dogs. I'm curious, before we end up, maybe you could share a story of the favorite thing that, or a couple, if you have a couple that you've trained with Blanca, or some training challenges that you've come across and how you overcame them.
My favorite behavior, I feel like, is it's a stationing behavior, but it is sometimes called a home behavior or parking, where she will sit between your legs and look up at you. It's so useful. Before, when we could go into the vets, I know many places are vet currently included too. We have curbside, but if you're at the counter where you're needing to pay, you don't have to worry that your dog is over here at the end of the leash doing we don't know what. She's sitting right there. And even sometimes, like if I'm washing dishes or preparing food, it's such a heavily reinforced behavior that she just comes and she'll pop in there without a cue. Also, the last place we were living, also an interim step to our next home, was in an apartment building. And so we had an elevator, and it was a really handy behavior in the elevator as well. So she would park between your legs and sit looking up. And the other part of your question was about challenges. I have to think about that. I think the biggest challenge is just sometimes people, and this goes for hearing animals, of course, too, wanting things to just be fluent and feel comfortable right away. And I try to just reiterate and emphasize for folks that, this is a novel skill. You're just starting to communicate without talking with your animal. And so it will feel more comfortable the more you do it. And I certainly, who in many cases don't see clients day to day, but maybe week to week or even a little bit bigger gap, can surely notice the difference. It's like anything. If you have a little bit of time in between and then you come back around, you can see those changes happening. But if you're living them, it might feel like things are moving along at a sloth or a snail's pace. So reassuring folks that just that practice and again, that daily like practice of utilizing those new skills of communicating again with tactile cues, with visual cues, and just practicing and continuing to expand your repertoire and your bond with your animal and your communication again skills as you move through your adventure together. That part can be challenging because people, I think, can feel very frustrated when something's new. I remember years ago we lived in Samoa, and I speak Spanish and I speak Tok-Pisin, which is another language in Papua New Guinea. And I had an interest in learning some Samoan. And I remember, I was taking some classes in a group setting with a friend who was teaching a bunch of us, and just learning a new skill. Sometimes it feels so frustrating and you're like, this is never going to feel fluent or comfortable. So just remembering that it's new and just take it easy and just go slow and don't beat yourself up if it's not perfect. And so it is a new experience trying out communicating with visual and tactile cues as opposed to verbal ones. So I think just keeping that in mind and moving through that journey is sometimes a challenge, but certainly one that we can overcome.
I think that everyone that's learned a new language could probably understand that. Have you found that the marker and visual cues have worked with everything that you've wanted to train, or have there been some times where you've had to think outside the box with the markers and cues you have already trained with Blanca?
Yeah, I think the tricky part can be if you're trying to mark something or add the cue as it's happening, which is when we would add a cue. First we back it up to the beginning as it's just starting, and then move it out in front so you can ask for the cue and then see the behavior occurring. But sometimes being able to mark precisely in the moment, because if your dog is looking over here and you're trying to get the marker down in front of their line of sight, which is again where you could use a tactile marker as well. And thinking about if you're trying to mark and then give a visual cue at the same time. So just the dexterity a little bit sometimes can take a little bit more brain power. But I haven't found anything that, we certainly couldn't teach her to do. We can teach animals to do anything they're physically capable of doing. Again, thinking about, of course, the considerations of should we in some cases, but yes, nothing that she couldn't do that I think a hearing dog could as well.
And I imagine for clients, you have to develop a sense of empathy, or it would build on your sense of empathy. And I imagine that maybe not for everyone, but for some, and I'm curious if you've ever got this kind of feedback that has translated to empathy towards other humans, developing that empathy for your dog and seeing things from their perspective and accommodating that. Sounds like there's a lot of lessons in there.
I agree. I think that's an important piece as well. Like you say, that recognizing, okay, my dog is experiencing the world a little bit differently. And so I need to be cognizant of that and recognize that. And like you said, there may be some accommodations, but also trying to make sure to expand their world as much as possible so that they have all of these experiences, these positive experiences and fun, enriching lives. And I think, like you said, the other good point was in terms of empathy and recognizing that that people can struggle because this is something that they hadn't expected or experienced. And I think, again, sort of the social media group, Facebook group kind of helps people to have that sense of community of other people who also have experienced, like you said, sometimes folks weren't recognizing that they were, or recognizing or expecting that their dog was even deaf. Like in Blanca's case, we didn't know at the beginning. And then realizing, okay, all right, how am I gonna do this now? I can't just ask her to lie down. So how do I go about that? And again, as professional trainer, we certainly recognize that there are definitely ways to communicate without verbal cues, but it might not be the first thought that you have. So realizing that caregivers, certainly who don't have even that level of experience as a trainer might, could even find that a little bit more difficult at the beginning. But again, I have lots and lots of people in the group who are sharing their lives with deaf animals and having a great time doing so. So certainly possible. Absolutely.
So Blanca is your only dog at the moment, right?
Currently, yes.
Future dogs, let's say you get another dog eventually that's not deaf. Would your feeling be to work on visual markers and cues? Or do you feel like you might revert back to auditory or both? Like what is have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, we only have Blanca right now because since George passed and we're kind of in transition and again with the moving. So my husband has overruled adding any other pets to the family at this particular time, which I understand and is a reasonable accommodation. But yeah, I think it would be great to continue to use some visual and tactile cues and or markers, because like we said, if the dog was to lose their hearing or become older, or if you just wanted to communicate with them sort of in secret, obviously it's not, but a lot of times if I was out in public with Blanca and I asked her to do something and people would be like, wow, how did that happen? Well, and then they would cause them to pause and say, wow, well, if you can teach an animal to do things or respond to something you're asking without even saying it, then by gosh, I should be able to communicate with my dog who can hear when I say something. So kind of even thinking backwards to, wow, it is possible. And like as if a deaf dog can respond, of course, my hearing dog can too. Of course, we know that. But just like with the woman who was deaf and didn't realize she could communicate with her hearing dog, sometimes it just takes an experience to make you think about something a different way where you hadn't even considered it. You just hadn't thought of it that way. So to answer your question, yes, I would like to think that, yes, I would still want to use visual and tactile cues. I enjoy our being able to communicate without always speaking with her. I think it's kind of a neat thing. I don't know how to explain that better, but I don't know. It almost feels like a special bond in a way. So.
Yeah, I imagine it would be, because Blanca would be going around the world trying to communicate with beings that she needed to communicate with to get things from or to get them to move away. But she would look to you as someone who understood that and could help her, which I assume is the same for a lot of dogs that aren't deaf and that have people who understand how behavior works as they're humans. I was just thinking maybe your next dog would be a blind dog, and then you'll have to learn everything.
I worked with a blind dog. We fostered a blind dog for a couple of months, and Miki Saito, who is KPA as well, she had a blind dog, Nono, and so she has some really good resources online, which is who I refer folks to if they have blind dog. This dog was blind and partially deaf, and so we could certainly use auditory cues with the dog. I actually had another friend who was fostering a dog. They named him Stevie Wonder. He was a blind dog too. And I think I liked working with the blind dogs, but again, because you could still use auditory cues, it didn't feel quite as, unique a little bit as not being able to communicate with your voice, like with the deaf dog. So
I was just thinking that there's lots of contexts with dogs where you can't use voice. I was just thinking as you're talking dog dancing, do you observe those sports and get curious about taking Blanca into? No, I'm just joking. But have you kind of had conversations with people who do those types of things and draw similarities between how they train?
Again, it's the body cue is giving the cue. When I was at Natural Encounters years ago doing the course there with Steve and Susan, one of the breaks they brought in, one of the trainers had one of the birds, because they do the show for Disney, and he was showing us sort of and as trainers in the room, we were all watching for the cues, the visual cues. Because he would say something like to the bird, like, you don't want to do that, right? And we all, of course, knew, him doing this was the cue to the bird to go no in response. But again, the audience may not who weren't trainers or looking for those kind of things, would be thinking, wow, this bird is amazing, responding to or just answering, the questions in English, when really it was all kinds of cues in the environment with his body language, et cetera. So like you say, these kind of things happen again across doing the dancing or with this kind of animal show or interactions across species besides dogs too. So using visual or auditory or non-auditory cues is not unique. I think just sometimes people have always had a hearing dog and they haven't thought about it that way. So I think my focus wasn't so much to say like, this is brand new or nobody's ever thought of this before, but just to really shine some specific light and provide a really good context for how to move forward in the best way possible using positive reinforcement with deaf dogs.
Last question, but at the moment, do I understand your focus with the course was to provide something that's not available, that you haven't found available online?
Right, I hadn't for sure, and like I said, it's not. I didn't invent the concept of non-auditory cues for sure, but I think there's nothing like that out there. And again, I was focusing on a specific market, but I've had, for example, a couple of trainers take it who don't have deaf dogs, but we're saying, again, it's all valuable information that anybody could benefit from. But yes, I was looking for folks who have just adopted a deaf dog. And what do I do now? Well, the book and now the course are resources that I feel like could really get folks started in the right direction. And
then let's say you're listening to this podcast and you have a deaf dog and you're interested in that community, that Facebook group. Is there any requirements to join that? How does one go about becoming part of that community?
Behavior and training, and there are just some questions that basically say, that we're a friendly group and we use positive reinforcement, and that you won't, do all the things that some groups don't want you to do in them, like yell and scream and things like that. So you answered the questions and I let you in.
Awesome. Hey, once again, thank you so much for sharing everything today, Terrie. Just before we do officially wrap up, though, I know we mentioned this towards the start of the episode, but can you just remind everyone listening where they can go to find out more about you, about the course, and if they wanted to get in touch, get in touch?
Yep. positiveanimalwellness.com. And again, courses is there. My blog is there. My contact information is there. And one more time for your ATA folks, there's a 10% off code of ATA if they would like to take the course.
Awesome. Well, we're really grateful for that code. Thank you for all of this. We will, of course, link to it all in the show notes as well for those listening. This has been so much fun from myself, and on behalf of everyone tuning in today, we really appreciate you taking the time to come back on the show with us. It's really appreciated, Terrie. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behavior geeks. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.